So if we look at the progesterone study, which we did under the NIH banner in the United States, and then SYNAPSE, which Andrew and others were involved with, which was an international study, we had over 200 positive results in the preclinical arena that this thing worked, and it worked in all kinds of different animals and under all kinds of different models. And we had, let's see, this just completely lost this. There we go, good. So we basically had an outcome assessment that was being used, which many of you are familiar with that have done rodent studies, the Morris-Water maze test. And so this was a test of memory and learning, and basically it's been the gold standard for most of the types of head injury models that we've used, whether controlled cortical impact or fluid percussion. So then, what happened though is that despite these 200 successful studies, somehow or another this got lost in translation, and I think we need to go back and think about why that got lost in translation. So one of the reasons is that if you look here, not only did they do this Morris-Water maze test for most of these results, but look, they're doing repeated measures, right? And they're looking at them frequently over time. And then what do we do for the human study? We do a single measure at 6 months. And this is a measure, I was calling it a measure of disability. Graham said that it was really more of a social handicap score, and we could discuss what it really is, but this is very different from this, right? I mean, there's almost no translatability between what is a memory and learning score. Memory and learning is probably part of the GOSE, but it's not all of the GOSE. So for some time, we've believed that there's lots of things going on underneath this very global measure that we look at, and so there's things to think about in terms of the cognitive domain, psychological health, quality of life, and so on. And all these things feed up into this very global outcome measure that we have. So we went completely the other direction. So rather than having either a 5-point or an 8-point score, in concert with our colleagues, CENTER-TBI, Nicole and Lindsay and so on, we started talking about how could we break down and look at these different categories. So this is our current outcome battery. And it is onerous, and it's one of the reasons why we're short on our elderly TBI patients. But as you can see here, we're looking at the GOSE, and we're looking at it in a couple of different ways. We're looking at cognition, we're looking at symptoms-based things, we're looking at participation, psychological health. We're really trying to look more deeply at what is really wrong with these people. So just to show you an example of how this is working, and this is a paper that just came out in Journal of Neurotrauma today, is we're taking a subset of these. So now we're trying to sort of look underneath the hood, if you will, of what's driving the GOSE. So we've got some measures of cognition, we've got some measures of psychological health, we've got a symptoms-based inventory, we've got satisfaction with life, and I'll show you some data about the motor score. So when you look at this here, I think it's very easy to see. First of all, the GOSE is a great anchor for doing this kind of work. So the folks that are back at work and they're having no issues, they should have very few problems, right? And as you move down this disability or sort of social handicap, what you're beginning to see is that these measures actually peg in nicely with what we're looking at with the GOSE. So not surprisingly, as you move from the 8s to the 5s, you start seeing more in the BSI, which is basically anxiety, depression, and somatization. So those scores are going up as the GOSE is coming down. Interestingly, you don't see a whole lot of variance here in the CVLT, suggesting that maybe if you're trying to drive your disability in one direction or another, that might not be the thing you want to work on. Maybe you want to target something like some of your psychological health measures. And again, not surprisingly, people that are 8s are pretty satisfied with their life, and people that are 5s are not very satisfied at all. So what this does is that, the way we're looking at it today is much like the GCS is sort of anchors at a clinical exam, and then you're looking underneath that or adding to that to sort of better describe these patients. The GOSE is a good anchor that we can now see how these other measurements feed into that, and may probably decide that one of these measures may be better for another clinical trial than others. So how does the physical function work in this? So one of the things that we found out, again, through international collaboration, is that in the United States, particularly with the progesterone study and several other studies have been done, we have tried to infer what the brain component of the GOSE is. And as Lindsay said, it was never meant to be a brain-specific measure. It incorporates all kinds of issues. And yet we were trying to infer this. Now, some people on our team and some of the Europeans that we talked to were like, well, you can't infer. A patient can't tell you, well, I'm back at work because, or I'm not back at work because I got a brain problem or my leg was broken. But we've actually tried to do this for a couple reasons. One is that historically we've been trying to infer. And secondarily, we wanted what we call the all score. The all score is what Center is doing. They're not discriminating between whether or not, if you've got somebody sitting in front of you who's cognizant and who's talking and so on, but they've got a leg and an external fixator and the arms like this, you're not asking them, well, why aren't you back to work? They're either back to work or they're not back to work. We're actually asking that question, and that we start off the GOSE with saying, is there polytrauma? And one of the things we think, and I know you guys are looking at AISs and so on, we may be able to adjust for this by looking for the polytrauma, but we're specifically asking this. So what we've got here is a measure now looking at all our TBI. And so this is all in the 13 to 15. So what you're seeing here is the dramatic effect of polytrauma on this measure in mild to basically GCS 13, 14, 15 patients. So what I would argue is that it may not necessarily be the best measure for that group of people, or you're going to have to exclude the polytrauma. Likewise, we also looked at this in the GCS 3 to 12 range and asked the same question, and surprisingly found that there is actually a little bit of effect of the body trauma in this as well. And Nancy Timken presented this at the National Neurotrauma Society. And, I think this is just something that we need to understand. Not one of these measures is perfect. There's a whole lot of things that the GOSE brings to the table. It's the only measure that we're looking at out of 26 that basically records death. Pretty important, mortality. The other things that we're seeing is that some of the ways that we used to dichotomize this, so by grouping the 7s and 8s together, you may want to split those up. And I think when you look at this paper that Len just published, I think it makes a very strong argument that 7s and 8s are different and probably shouldn't be, aggregated together. So I want to make sure, because I had this discussion earlier this morning, these tools that we've started off with historically are going to be useful. We're going to continue to use them. And I think what this exercise is about is finding some better measurements here. And at least what we're seeing in this milder group of injured patients, things like cognitive measures, which we've been in love with as neuroscientists, right? These things may not be driving the equation. What may be driving the equation is this psychological health stuff. And so if we're really trying to get people back to work, rather than trying to do some neuroprotection drug, unless it's got side effects of also fixing depression, anxiety, and headache, maybe those are the things we actually need to be working on to get these people less disabled. So I think we're very early in the game. Again, this notion of us talking together has already led to, I think, advances in our understanding here. And we're going to continue to work together with everyone as we do this. And again, I wanted to get through this to buy us some time, and we can talk about this over wine, because outcomes is about the hardest thing that we do here. The biomarkers and the imaging are pretty straightforward, but the outcomes are hard. Thank you.